have. I know this is a lot on one screen, but this is the best graphic I could find that fits a ton of history onto one slide. So we're going to start I'm going to not, of course, go over all of this in detail, but it just gives you some general themes of Jewish history up until the writing of Revelation, which we're going to place eventually at the end of the first century. So starting all the way in around 600s BCE. So that stands for before the Common Era, or it's also BC before Christ. But generally, in historian speak, before the Common Era, BCE is what we go by. We have a conquest of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And so there's a destruction of the temple, and there are Jewish leaders taken into exile. And that's happening in the end of the 6th century. And then we have Persian rule up into 332. And then we have, of course, the campaign of Alexander the Great from 333 to 332 BCE. Alexander the Great, as you may recall, has an untimely death in his 30s, and his campaign that has crossed so much of the Mediterranean has yielded a lot of land to be under his control, Macedonian control, except he's dead. So what happens? It's split into major leaders that become major empires around the Mediterranean. And so you'll see that rule of Palestine and the Jews at that time switches hands many, many times, right? So we have the Babylonians, Persians. Alexander the Great comes in, brings in Hellenistic culture, worship, structures, architecture, and then we have a split into kingdoms. Then Palestine is ruled by the Ptolemies, dynasties centered in Egypt. Then the Seleucids centered in Syria. And at the end of that time, there's a revolt by Jewish leaders called the Maccabean Revolt, led by various parts of the family of the Maccabees. And then from there on, Palestine is ruled by Hasmoneans, which is stemming from Jewish background. And then we have Jewish sects, etc. And then, of course, we have Rome. Rome comes in along with the whole takeover, basically, of the Mediterranean by growing Roman power. And then we have Roman imperial rule, beginning with Caesar Augustus with Julius Caesar into Caesar Augustus, and so on and so forth. So we have client kings that are put in place, right? Delegated power over Palestine under Roman rule. So we have Herod, and of course you recall from Christmas stories, he's the king at the time of the birth of Jesus, and then different other rulers of Palestine, Judea, etc., by different client kings and procurators like Pontius Pilate, prefects under Roman rule, right? So they're overseeing that geographic area of Palestine under Roman rule. So we have this change of hands over and over again, exile into return, into destruction of Jerusalem and then revolt, and so on and so forth, rebuilding of a second temple under Herod. And then finally, we have in 70 CE, in the Common Era, or AD, in the year of our Lord, we have the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple again. So just a series of catastrophic, traumatic events in Jewish history and the changing of hands of power. So imagine you're in first century CE, towards the end of it, you, as part of a Jewish diaspora community, have seen and know stories of all sorts of destruction, all sorts of changes of power, never really having true Jewish agency within that area, right? So this is a cyclical, it seems like, series of events in which the power in place goes from all the way from Babylon to Roman rule, right? So those two figures, both of Babylon, that first destruction, and then second destruction under Rome, are going to be key moments of history, especially in the book of Revelation, as it's bringing up all of this trauma and all this destruction, and also gesturing towards ultimate justice, that somehow true rule, that's God's kingdom, that is the distribution of justice and the rule of justice is going to happen, right? So here I'm just setting the stage for all the framing of what this text is going to be talking about, right? So you see the repeat of tragedy, catastrophe, disaster, and rule. So we looked at certain different texts that are of apocalyptic nature last time, and I'm going to just place them on the chart so we can see where those are coming in. So at around 170 to 163 BCE, again, these are our closest guesses in terms of what the text contains. And so where we might place it is we have First Enoch, and that contains different apocalyptic texts, especially the apocalypse of the animals, which speaks of the different changing of hands of rule is allegorized as different animals. And that's also where we get all the animals and beasts of Revelation is copying this kind of allegorical speak of change of hands of power will be represented by different animals or different metals or different signs and symbols. Then you might be, when we have the death of Antiochus in 164 BCE, Antiochus Epiphanes is probably one of the most vilified and horrible rulers of Palestine under the Seleucids. So he's a Syrian ruler of the place, and he desecrated the temple. He forbid Jewish worship. He's the main villain of the Maccabean revolt, right? And so right around that time, we have the Maccabean revolt, and then we have also um, the composition of the book of Daniel right around that time. So all the apocalyptic visions that Daniel has, the dreams he has, involves all the events leading up to and in the midst of Maccabean revolt. And then we have, after the Maccabean revolt and all of this, we have a flourishing of different sects of Judaism, which include, you might be familiar with mention of the Essenes, which are seen as an ascetic group, sometimes associated with the Qumran community by the Dead Sea, and where we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have, of course, Pharisees, Sadducees, Zealots, the Sicarii, which are possibly zealots, political insurrectionists at the time. And of course, you can include in this the Jesus movement, right? So after Jesus' ministry on earth and after his crucifixion, there is a rise of what can be seen as a sect as well, right? If we really put it within its historical context, it's not that Christianity just arose right out of nothing, but really grew in the beginning as a Jewish sect that began around the time when there's lots of debate about how to be a Jew, how to follow the Torah, how to understand God's covenant with the Jewish people. And all of that within the context of a lot of trauma. And so Jesus and his debates with different rabbis, Pharisees in the Gospels, right, as a rabbi is also participating in that cultural, political negotiation of how do we be faithful, obedient Jews. And his following after his death is part of a different sect, right, of the Jesus movement. And then on the far right-hand side, we have the destruction of the temple, as I've mentioned, under Titus and Vespasian. So Titus marches in after a siege, has the temple sacked, and Jerusalem, the city, also destroyed. And Vespasian is Caesar at that time. And then we have the rule of Domitian, which is usually where scholars have a general consensus of when the Revelation of John is written. So maybe around 95 CE under Domitian, who's ruling. He's one of the Flavians of the Flavius family, including Titus and Vespasian. So this is post 70 CE, post destruction of the temple. And I'll get to why we think that that's the date in just a second. So here's the whole swath of history leading up to where I put the star is probably where we can locate the writing, the time of writing of our book, Revelation.